If you're a DIY maker like me, working in a small space with not very many tools, then working with rough timber can be intimidating and more than a little frustrating. Whether you're making a big cabinet or a small side table, at some point you're going to need flat wood. The problem is, wood doesn't come flat when it's rough. This stuff certainly isn't. It's full of all sorts of weird curves and wood movement that's caused as the wood's drying after it's been chopped down and cut into boards. Let's be honest though, the rewards of using rough timber can be massive. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I've used to get even the roughest boards flat, and they'll work in even the smallest spaces or the smallest budgets. And I'll show you what I think is the only essential big machine for DIY furniture makers. One of these is perfect for you. The most common issues you'll see are cupping, where the board curves across the width as the middle dries, bowing, where the wood curves along the length of the board, and twist, where the opposite corners of the board just end up in different places. Most rough boards have got at least one of these issues, and sometimes all 3. Now, if you watch a lot of YouTube, you could be forgiven for thinking that you've only got 2 real options if you want flat wood. The first is to buy plywood, which is already flat anyway, and the second is to have a workshop full of specialist machinery. But there's so many more options. I mean, people have been making fine furniture for hundreds of years, probably thousands of years, well before plywood or YouTubers with big workshops came along. And the thing that those people realised about getting flat wood is you only actually need 2 things. The first is a flat surface, and the second is a sharp blade, just like this hand plane. I know a lot of people are put off by hand planes and hand tools more generally, but these would probably be used by more furniture makers throughout history than any other method. The first examples that we've got are from Roman times, which means they were probably nicked from the empire a couple of thousand of years before that. And there's all kinds of specialist types for specialist jobs, but that's a different video for another time. To keep it simple today, I'm just going to use this one that I picked up from the big orange DIY shop. Just make sure that it's well set up and that your iron is properly sharp. I'll leave a link to a good video in the description. So the first step to getting a flat board is working out where the high spots are. On a cupped board like this, that's normally going to be a ridge or a crown on one face and then 2 high points on the other. I like to start with those edges down, which means the whole board is not going to be rocking around while I'm putting pressure on it and planing. On a twisted board, you'll probably find that the high points are at either side, and I like to mark them with a pencil so I know where I'm working first. So we're going to start by focusing on that high spot that we've identified. We're going to do a couple of extra strokes along the pencil marks, and then we can work our way outwards to make sure that things are flat. So on here, I might take, 4, 5 strokes in the middle, and then extend those strokes further out to make sure that everything's flat. And once I've done one full width of the board, then I'll come back again and see how flat we are. So that's getting pretty close to flat now, but there's still a couple of obvious things. There's still some really quite deep gouges, so it's rough. So although we're getting close to flat, we still need to get smooth. And the other thing we need to double check is that we've not accidentally now introduced twist onto the top of this board with uneven planing. And we can use a really, really traditional method with a pair of winding sticks. Winding sticks are just a couple of bits of straight and parallel wood. Plywood, or this is just some old pine, is kind of perfect for this. And we're going to use these on the board to check whether these are still parallel at each edge. And what we're looking for is to see if any part of the wood is higher than the other, so if it's just coming out of level. This is pretty good actually, but if I could see a bit of wood like that, or if this bit of wood was popping up on one side, then I'd know that there's some twist in the boards, and I could just take a few passes on that high spot and clean it back up again. It's looking pretty flat. I'm happy with that. Now, don't think for a second that you have to have a big workbench like this one before you can start flattening your own boards. For the first couple of years of making, I just used a bit of old OSB slung across some gym equipment, and that was absolutely fine. I just clamped down some stops instead of bench dogs. Where there's a will, there's a way, and don't let a lack of equipment be the reason that you don't get started with this stuff. But if you do want to build your own workbench, then I've got some plans on my shop at northernworks.co that you might want to check out. Now that you've got one flat face, you can use this as a reference to cut an edge to make panels or other joinery, and then you can flip it over and you can use it as a reference to get the other side flat as well. Or just don't bother. I mean, who's even looking at the underside of your coffee table? Anyway, this plane cost me about 30 quid, and it'll get a board just as flat as an industrial machine that costs 15 grand. The only difference is it'll take a lot longer and you'll need a lot more patience, which is fine if you're doing a small project like a box, but maybe not if you're doing a bigger project. I have got a tool that could help speed things up, and it still costs less than a date night at that nice pizzeria around the corner. The electric plane. It's both wonderful and terrifying. Just like a hand plane, it's got a flat reference surface, but instead of just one safe solid blade, it's got two that spin around at high speed and will cut through absolutely anything that you put in its way. So be extra careful with your pepperoni. The good news is that makes it really effective on bigger and thicker pieces of wood, like this one. The other difference between this and a hand plane is the flat bottom of this plane is split into two. The back section is fixed in place, while the front section moves up and down. This knob on the top controls the depth of the cut, and you really need to be thinking about how much you're taking off with each pass, because very quickly you can turn a 50mm piece of wood into pencil shavings. But apart from that, the technique's pretty much the same as with a hand plane. You start by taking off the high spots on your board and then work across the whole width to make it nice and flat, preferably working with the grain. You can also use this as kind of your first step, get it close to flat, and then come back with a hand plane and get it really nice and smooth. I've also found that if you're trying to get the board to a certain thickness, it's better to get both faces flat and parallel with one another first before you start taking off loads and loads of material. I have made that mistake in the past and ended up with wonky boards and had to start again. So hopefully you can learn from my mistake and not have to make it yourself. One downside is it does make a proper mess, doesn't it, Arch? What is this? Now, some of you will be thinking, this all looks like a very time-consuming and not very exciting way to make a ton of mess, and you just want to get on with the building part. Surely there must be an easier way to get flat boards. And I do think that's a totally fair question, especially if you're just starting out. And yeah, there are easier ways to get flat boards. In fact, the easiest way is to buy your wood already flat. In the UK, we call this planed all round, or PAR. You might also have heard it called surfaced on four sides, or S4S. This wood comes flat and ready for you to cut into the right dimensions and start using and get cracking. But it's important to remember that wood can still move even after it's been planed, and sometimes even more after it's been planed than before it was planed. So it's a good idea to bring it into your workspace and let it rest, maybe for about a week, let it acclimatise before you use it. And even then, you might still need to do some flattening. Another option is to use sheet goods like plywood. Engineered sheet materials usually are flat from the factory and they tend not to move around, so they're a good option if you need something stable like a big cabinet. You will have to think about how you cover the plywood edges if you're going for a more natural wood finish. But in my experience, both high quality sheet goods and planed all round hardwoods have got one major downside compared with buying rough timber. Let's imagine that you want to make a new media cabinet for your living room, something that you're going to look at every day and be so proud that you made it. So you want it to be about 150 centimeters wide, maybe 45 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters deep, and you think that it'll look really nice made out of 18mm oak. Now, to build something like this, you're going to need about 4.5 square meters of wood. Let's call it 5, because you know something's always going to go wrong. If you want to get good quality oak-faced plywood, and you're going to need 2 sheets, that's going to set you back about 430 quid. If you want solid oak that's planed all round, then the cheapest that I could find was about 400 quid, but more likely you're looking between 500 and 600 pounds. Whereas to get the same amount for rough oak boards, it's more like 300 quid. And there's no right or wrong answer here. And it completely depends on what you value the most, whether it's convenience or saving some money. If you want to just get cracking, then spend the extra money and get the plywood or the planed all round boards. I don't mind spending a bit of extra time flattening those rough boards if it means I can save a bit of cash and spend that on something else. In fact, the money that I saved on buying the wood for this cabinet project meant that I was able to put that money into a new tool. So that basically means that this benchtop thicknesser was free, right? Well, not quite, but the money I saved buying rough wood this time around did almost cover the cost of that machine. And the more I use it, the more I'm going to save. Not to mention all of the hours of hand planing that this machine has already saved me. It is, as they say, a game changer. In fact, I think it might be the only big machine that you need to build furniture in a DIY workshop. I mean, there's always more machines that you could buy, there's always more that you could spend your money on, but there's so much that you can do with a machine like this in a small DIY workshop. You just have to remember 3 basic rules. First, if it goes in bent, it'll come out bent. Getting boards flat with a thicknesser is pretty much the same as using a hand plane. You start by getting one face flat, and then you turn that over, use it as a reference face, and you can get the other face flat as well. I like to run the board through cup down, get the top flat, and then I can just flip it over and flatten the other side. But it's important to remember that a thicknesser keeps things parallel, so it uses the bottom face of whatever you put in it as a reference to then make the top flat, which means if you put a rough twisted board through a thicknesser, then you're going to get a smooth twisted board out the other side. If you want a flat smooth board, then you're going to need a flat reference surface for your piece of wood to go on. Now this doesn't have to be complicated. You can use any piece of flat wood to make a planing jig. A piece of plywood or MDF is perfectly fine, and then you can use some wedges to keep your top surface flat as it goes through the planer. And once one face is flat, you can take it off the planing jig and run the other side through as normal. Secondly, don't rush. Now, you might have seen people with big industrial machines absolutely ramming their boards through and taking 10 mil off in each pass. Your benchtop thicknesser will not handle this. The best you're going to get is some really bad burn marks on your boards, and the worst you're going to get is a burned out motor, which is no good to anyone. In any case, taking a mil or a couple of mil off at a time is still going to be way faster than doing it by hand, and if you follow the last rule, then you might even end up with a better surface too. Rule 3, grain direction does matter. Benchtop thicknessers have got what I think is a bit of an unfair reputation as being a rough machine. You know, able just to tear through boards no matter what direction you put them through. And to some extent that is true. If you put a board through against the grain, it will usually get through it. But you're probably going to end up with a fuzzy surface, or even worse, you're going to get some tear out. Turn your board around and run it with the grain, then you're going to find that even with a benchtop machine like this, you're going to get a really silky, smooth surface, which is going to save you a bunch of time later when it comes to finishing. I've even heard that you can make it run quieter and get an even better finish by replacing the stock blades with a helical cutter head. Jack from Sumere Builds has got a really good video showing how that difference works out, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Right, I promise this video is not an ad, but I do have to say this Metabo thicknesser has been great pretty much straight out of the box. The only small tweak I had to make was to fix an issue that I was having with snipe. Snipe is where the cutting blade digs a little bit deeper into the end of the board as it tips up off the end of the infeed or outfeed tables. The very simple fix that I did was to raise the angle of the tables by just a hair, which stopped the board tipping and kept the cut smooth. And then for longer boards, I just make sure that it's supported all the way through to the end of the cut. If you're having any issues with snipe, then try that first and it might be all you need to solve your problem. Well, there you go. There's loads of different ways that you can get flat boards for your next project, even in a small home workshop like this one. So there's really no excuse for you not to get out there and crack on and build something for yourself. And if you're looking for inspiration, then this side table was built with just a handsaw and a power drill. And don't forget to subscribe so you can see how my big cabinet is going to turn out once I've got through the rest of this 25 boards that I've got to flatten. See you again. Come on.